So welcome back, everyone, to the Civics Project. I'm delighted today to focus on the subject of disability rights and to welcome our guest, Deborah Dorfman from Disability Rights Connecticut, the Executive Director. I'm Beth Ribet. I'm the Director of Repair and the host of the Civics Project. And we will begin with a brief land acknowledgement. So Repair would like to acknowledge the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Tarahatom, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Hanukvatam, the ancestors, Ahihiram, the elders, and Iohinkem, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. And as noted, it's my privilege today to introduce Deborah Dorfman, the Executive Director of Disability Rights Connecticut. Deborah has approximately 30 years of disability rights legal advocacy experience. Most immediately, she was a managing attorney at the Northwest Justice Project in Seattle, where she and her colleagues established a statewide free special education legal clinic for low-income families with students with disabilities. Prior to that, she's held a number of positions, including as the legal director of the Center for Public Representation. She's worked with protection and advocacy systems, which for those who are not familiar, is the federally created and funded entity which advocates for people with disabilities, particularly those who are institutionalized in some way. She's worked for Disability Rights California, the Disability Rights Legal Center, Disability Rights Washington. In short, she has been incredibly active in disability rights advocacy over these past decades across a number of different US states, and has advocated in very localized and individual claims, but is also focused on class action and systemic reform through litigation. In one particular case that I took note of, she advocated for children with intellectual disabilities who are incarcerated in the juvenile justice system. She particularly is experienced and specializes significantly, although it's not her only skill, in advocacy for people with mental disabilities, and is considered among the foremost legal advocates for people with mental illness, mental disabilities in the United States. I'm not sure that she would acknowledge that particular representation, but I would certainly assert it, and quite a number of people who are considered leaders in the field have represented her in that way as well. She is, let's see, a graduate of New York Law School and New York University and the University of California at Berkeley. And she is extremely experienced in litigation and has also published a number of academic articles dealing with issues related to mental disability law and disability rights. So I really could go on speaking about Deborah Dorfman, who I consider both an esteemed colleague and a friend. But I think I'll just close by saying she's someone I consider a real warrior for people who are exceptionally vulnerable in institutions where power abuses are rampant. And I can't think of a more urgently needed area of legal advocacy. There are a few I consider as urgent. This is one of those where we always need more great people. And if I could identify what would improve the status of people with mental disabilities in the United States, aside from particular policy and structural changes, I would want just a cadre of attorneys who were like Deborah Dorfman or had been trained by her. If we had a lot more people with this skill set and level of commitment, we would start to see some deep systemic changes. So Deborah, again, thank you and welcome for joining us amidst what I'm sure is a busy weekend schedule. And I want to start by asking you to tell us a little bit for our lay audience, people who are not lawyers or attorneys, a little bit about what sort of rights are connected to disabilities in the US legal system. What rights do people with disabilities have in the US?
So, thank you, and thanks for inviting me today. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to be here with all of you. So the question that you asked is a really broad question, because there's actually a whole host of rights that people with disabilities have. Disability rights as a sort of an area of law is actually a really relatively new area of law compared to other laws that have been around for centuries and centuries. But disability laws is a pretty new area of law in that it really, things didn't really evolve until the 60s and 70s, when things really started to get going. But since that time, we've had a lot of developments, and of particular importance was the enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that really brought to people with disabilities in the United States really broad protections under federal law for a whole variety of things. So employment, access to public programs, activities, and services. So that could be everything from access to the courts, could be access to public housing, could be access to even services in jails and prisons, juvenile halls, all sorts of, just a really wide range. And certainly the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, isn't the only law, but it's one that has a broad range of accessibility, and also requires that people who operate places of public accommodation also make things accessible, and also accessibility and communication. And there are, of course, other rights in the context of special education, housing, and a whole, like I said, a whole social security benefits, a whole host of rights. And the states also have a range of rights that they provide through relevant state laws as well.
Thank you. And just to sort of have concrete examples, you mentioned employment. Does this mean people with disabilities have a right to be employed? What are the rights we have in employment settings exactly?
So one really important right is the sort of an overarching right, which is the right not to be discriminated against in employment because of a person's disability or association with people who have disabilities, and or a perception that you have a disability. So that's a really important right. In addition, there are rights to getting, as part of the right to be free from discrimination, is the right to have reasonable accommodations in employment, so that as long as the person is otherwise qualified to do the job, the essential functions of the job, then the person should be able to have accommodations. So, for example, let's say that a person works for an employer that is covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Title I, and they need an accommodation, they need a change in their schedule so they can come to work. Let's say that usually work hours are 9 to 5, but they need to come a little bit later because they take medications for their disability, and that makes them sleepy. So they really can't start until 10:30, and they can stay a little bit later. So it's like that would be an example of something that might be a reasonable accommodation, as a change in a schedule. So those are some examples of some rights. So also a right not to be segregated in employment because of your disability. So there shouldn't be a situation where because a person has a disability and they may act differently, have different needs, look differently, that shouldn't mean that the person should be separated away from their other colleagues who don't have disabilities. And also there are some rights around physical accessibility to a building. If you need to go to work, you need to be able to get into the building. You need to be able to get around at work, and you may need accommodations at your desk. So those are some examples.
Good, good. And you mentioned like public spaces. Would this include things like restaurants or movie theaters, or is it just about the areas you mentioned earlier, like healthcare or getting access to the courts?
Yeah. So so anti-discrimination in terms of people with disabilities goes much broader than just what I mentioned. Those were just some examples. So you're right, that restaurants and movie theaters, if you go to watch sports at a sports arena, parks, swimming pools, all kinds of places need to be accessible to people with disabilities. And sometimes it's not just physical accessibility, but it's also modifying, making modifications in the way in which a service is being provided, making sure that there's effective communication. So if you do need to go to a healthcare provider, dentist, and you need to have some way to communicate, and that you need an accommodation or modification in order to do that, that also is included as well.
Okay.
So it's very broad.
Great, great. That helps us understand a little bit better. I know there are different laws that deal with disability. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about like what's the difference between a disability right and a disability benefit, like Social Security?
Yeah, so a benefit is, well, Social Security is a really good example. So some people who have disabilities qualify for certain benefits, and those benefits might be benefits from the federal government, like Social Security benefits. And so those are, for example, assistance, it's financial assistance that people who qualify get from the federal government each month, and that money is used, they can use to spend on their living expenses and those kinds of things. Other people get, sometimes the states will provide some cash benefits to people with disabilities as well. So that's like when we talk about benefits, that's an example. Some people with disabilities are entitled to free medical care as a result of their disability. So if they qualify for Social Security, for supplemental income, SSI, then they will likely be able to qualify for Medicaid covered services, which are free medical services through Medicaid through the states, which it comes paid for by the federal government, but goes through the states. And so those are some examples of benefits. A legal right is different than a benefit in that, you know, it's not like cash or a medical service. It's a right that you have. For example, you have the right to have the freedom of speech, right? So you have the right to say, and there are some exceptions, because in all laws, there's always a lot of exceptions. So I'm not saying there's no exceptions, but for example, you know, most of the time, a private citizen has the right to say what they want, unless it falls into an exception, like, you know, threatening direct harm to somebody or something like that. But mostly, for the most part, you know, if I want to say, I look at a painting and I say, I really hate that painting, I have the right to say that I hate a particular painting, because that's my opinion. That doesn't make the painting bad or good. It's just my opinion about what I think about a painting. So that's my legal right to say that. So that's not like a benefit. I'm not going to get any cash or any services out of that. That's just a right I have. If somebody tells me, well, you can't say that, and I'm going to go to court and get an order to tell you to stop saying that, then I can go to court and I can say, no, that's my right. I get to say that. And then the judge will decide whether or not it's my legal right to say, I don't like the painting. I don't know if that answers the question or not.
Yeah, no, I'm getting at it. What I'm hearing you say is that a right is something the state can't take away from you or should protect from having violated. But there can be exceptions to rights, right? They're not necessarily all encompassing.
Right.
Maybe we can think more about how that applies to disability. But let me ask you this. How are disability rights protected or enforced in the United States? So if somebody violates, or you believe they violated your disability right, what happens? Is there an entity that's out there and already checking and making sure that doesn't happen? Is there something the individual has to do? What's the process look like in the US legal system?
So really depends on the situation. For the most part, if you feel like your rights have been violated, it's best to go and ask for help, because probably more likely than not, somebody might not see that your rights are being violated and just help you anyways. So most people have to ask for help. The problem is that a lot of people don't know that their rights have been violated. So it's important to understand what your rights are, and it really depends on the circumstances. So for example, if you trying to get a job, let's go back to the job example, and you feel like, you know, you're trying to go to get um, uh, a job, you've applied for a job and you're going for an interview, but you need some accommodations at the interview, and you tell the prospective employer you need accommodations for your disability, and they say, well, no, oh, you have a disability, we don't want to hire you, forget about it, we're canceling the um, the interview. So what would you do? Well, there isn't an entity that's just out there watching and saying, oh, we saw that happened, we're going to help you. You would have to ask for help, but you could go to a number of places to get help. So one of the things that you could do in that situation is you could file a complaint with a, which is with a, either there's some state entities that have places to file complaints. Usually each state has their own basically like like an employment discrimination fair housing agency that you can file a complaint at, and they might be able to help you. Or the federal government has something called the EEOC, and you could file a complaint with them. You could also call, there's a protection and advocacy system, which is, I work at Disability Rights Connecticut, and we are federally mandated to exist, and there's one in every state and every US territory. So you could call the one in your state, because there's one in every state. So the one in California, for example, that's Disability Rights California. Connecticut, obviously, Disability Rights Connecticut. If you live in Connecticut, you could call and you could have an intake and explain the problem and see if they could help. There's no guarantee that they can help you, but they may be able, if they can't, they may be able to give you other resources and other referrals to help. Or maybe they can help you and take your case. It just kind of depends. There's also other disability rights legal advocacy agencies around the United States. Oftentimes, if you qualify financially, you can go to even some legal aid offices, and they may also provide assistance. So there are a number of places that you can go to ask for help. And even if they can't help you, they may well be able to tell you where you can go to get some help. But you know, for the most part, there isn't somebody who's just sitting there waiting to in spots of violation. Now, where there are some exceptions to that, where, for example, the protection and advocacy systems, like where I work at Disability Rights Connecticut, we have an obligation to monitor to make sure that individuals with disabilities are not being abused and neglected, and also not having their rights violated. So we often will go into, for example, nursing homes, state psychiatric facilities, certain group homes in a community setting, or any kind of facility, jails, prisons, homeless shelters, and we monitor, and schools, and we monitor them. And then as a result of monitoring, sometimes we identify abuse and neglect. And as a result of that, we may take steps to address abuse and neglect when we've monitored and identified that. So those are some examples where, as a result of monitoring, and there may be other entities too that do, for example, the federal government, they will monitor and do and make sure that there's compliance with certain federal requirements at certain hospitals or other programs that they federally fund. And so they may identify rights violations, and on their own may take steps to enforce the rights. So for example, the Department of Justice sometimes goes into, sometimes enforces rights where they've investigated and identified rights violations, but that's up to them. And similarly, and you can file complaints with them, or sometimes they identify things and they do their own investigations and identify things on their own, or they get complaints. The same is true with the Office of Civil Rights. For example, at the Health and Human Services, you can file complaints with them, or the Department of Education, the US Department of Education. So there's a whole variety of places where you, at the federal level and at the state level, where you can file complaints and try to ask for help.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So one question, so I'm hearing that there are a number of ways, a number of steps you can take. I'm also hearing that with limited exceptions, generally the government is not already monitoring or looking for disability discrimination on the ground. So the person who experiences it has to know that it is or that it might be discrimination and has to go somewhere to get help or to report it.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Most of the time that's
Most
true.
of the time. Yeah. With some exceptions. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. And just practically, when you, let's say you file a complaint with a state Human Rights or Civil Rights Commission, or you go to the Federal Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, or the Office for Civil Rights, or to the Department of Education, and the entities you named, what comes of that? Can they order the discriminating party to do things? Can they make them pay you money? What are the concrete consequences that people who engage in, or companies that engage in disability discrimination might face?
Yeah, well, it sort of depends on the entity and what power that they have, but a lot of times you can go and you file the complaints, and sometimes what ends up happening is that the parties end up having what we call a mediation, where they both volunteer to come and sit at the table, and the entity tries to facilitate some agreement. And that agreement might result in some payment of some money, some policy changes, some changes physically to a building, if that's part of the problem. So that's one thing that can happen. There may also be a finding that some of these entities make that discrimination occurred, and they may say to the offending party, you need to, make amends by paying some damages or changing your policies or doing various different things. If the offending party doesn't do and refuses to do that, oftentimes that means that the issue goes to court. And then, so for example, if there's a state and civil rights commission that says to an entity or a person that's discriminating, well, you've discriminated against the complainant, and so now we think you need to pay damages and you need to allow this person to have the following accommodations. And let's say that the person who's doing the discriminating says no. Well, that means that they might have to go to court and ask a judge to order them to do that. And so a lot of things do get resolved at mediation, or where an entity like a Civil Rights Commission or the EEOC or something like that tells the discriminating party that they're violating the law. A lot of times that's where it ends and the person fixes the problem. But sometimes they say no, in which case then a lawsuit has to be filed and the court has to decide. So I hope that helps to answer the question. It just kind of depends on I'm sorry for the answer. Always, it kind of depends. Typical lawyer response. That's true.
It's a complex system. So, I would rather have you be imprecise than inaccurate.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. Let me ask you this. So one of the things we know is that not all, but some disabilities can interfere significantly with a person's ability to advocate for themselves. For instance, even in doing something like asking for help or going so far as to file a complaint, file a lawsuit. And that's not even acknowledging, that there can be economic barriers. Not everybody can afford an attorney and is aware of free options. Does our legal system do anything to ensure that disability rights are still protected when people are unable to exercise or defend those rights on their own? And I know you've partially answered this question in acknowledging the protection and advocacy system, but this is a big challenge. If we've got a really complicated system and we've got people with disabilities, that may make it very hard to navigate that system. In practice, what's happening?
So again, the answer really is dependent on the issue. Obviously, you're right. You can come to well, the issue and also where you live. That's another piece of it. But if you have that situation, obviously trying to find an advocate to help, whether that's going to a formal advocacy agency like Disability Rights Connecticut, for example, or even asking for a friend or somebody else to help. That is one way that somebody can get help. But in terms of a formal system, in terms of how like what's out there formally, it's very difficult, because there isn't in except for in criminal cases and certain civil matters like civil commitment or the right to refuse antipsychotic medications or something like that. In certain and other civil matters, there's mostly no right to have a lawyer. And that's a problem. And so because there's not a right to have a lawyer, there's no right necessarily to have help. There are some courts in some jurisdictions around the country that have implemented some process for people to get some help, which is really good. It's not necessarily a right to a lawyer, but there is a process. So for example, in Washington State, if a person has a disability and they need some accommodations so that they can navigate the court system, they can ask for the court to provide them with to ask for accommodations. And in some cases, there may be counsel appointed, but there's no guarantee of that. And that's what makes it really, really hard. So there's all these rights that people have, but it's hard to always enforce those rights. And I don't mean to be negative, but I just want to be realistic about that. In criminal cases, it's different, but or if somebody's being told they have to stay in a psychiatric hospital involuntarily, or they're being placed under guardianship or conservatorship, that kind of thing is a different situation, because then there is counsel. But if you're feeling like you've been discriminated against by your landlord or by your healthcare provider or by your employer, there's no right to get an attorney. And so the thing that I would really encourage is contacting your local protection and advocacy system. Like I said, in California, it's Disability Rights California. There are offices throughout the state. And even if they can't take your case, they will likely be able to give you some information and referral. They do their very best to do that, because obviously everybody has limited resources, but they have lots of information and can provide, again, information and referral of where you might be able to go. And if you have a friend who can help you fill things out, that can be useful. Sometimes if you go to a court and you try to fill out the papers yourself, there's a person at the court who can look at the papers and kind of they can't give you legal advice, but they can just make sure you fill them all out correctly. But, it's always best to try to get some help. And that's why I encourage, either calling a protection and advocacy system or calling some other legal services agency and seeing if you can, at least, even if they can't help, get some information or referral.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's really useful. Do you feel like protection and advocacy or legal aid systems, do they have enough money? Do they have enough staff? Can they meet the demand?
You mean to just like to represent everybody?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I wish we could. It's probably the hardest part of our job. And I've been doing this for a long time. And I've worked for protection and advocacy systems and a bunch of other places. And I can say that the biggest challenge in every single place has been just there's, the demand for for help. the need for help and just the finite amount of resources. And, we always kind of joke with ourselves like, oh, we wish we could put ourselves out of business, meaning we wish we could help everybody and the problems would go away, but they never do. And so what ends up happening is we have to figure out, well, what cases can we take? How do we best spend our resources? And so that's a challenge everywhere you go. And so that's why it's really important to know. One thing that I think is really important is that people with disabilities really have as much understanding as possible of their rights and learn about self-advocacy skills, because there's actually quite a bit that folks can do on their own or with a little bit of assistance to, enforce your own rights. And so that's a really important piece of, the services that we provide, like in Connecticut.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Our Zoom audience has a question. Sharon and Eric are wanting to know more about what fits in the definition of disability, and they're specifically asking if you have a mental illness, does it qualify as a disability?
So if you have, the way it works is that disability is for the purpose of legal issues are really defined by whatever legal statute is applicable. So under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the way that disability is defined is a there's a certain set of categories of disabilities, and then the real key question is, does it affect more than one or more major life functions? So that could be eating, drinking, walking, breathing,
working, right?
yeah, working. So for the most, and states have their own definition, but sometimes they're broader than the Americans with Disabilities Act. They're not usually more narrow. They're usually, if anything, they're the same or broader. But usually if somebody has a psychiatric disability, mental health condition, and it affects one or more major life activities, then the answer is yes, then that does qualify as a disability. So does that help to answer the question? Does that make sense?
So, and maybe we can do some examples. Like, let's say if you had clinical depression and it was making it hard to concentrate and get your work done, then it would be affecting work.
That's right.
If you had post-traumatic stress disorder and it was giving you nightmares and disrupting your ability to sleep, then sleep is a major life function, so that would count. If you had, let's say, a neurological condition that was affecting your ability to speak, right, then talking is a major life activity. And so that could also count. So the basic idea is the mental illness has to be changing your life in some significant way. It doesn't have to be enormous, but it has to be something significant. Is that about right? Did I get it?
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right.
Great. So mental illnesses can count, but they don't presumptively count until we assess whether they're significantly affecting your life. Usually, if you go to the point where you're saying you have a mental illness and you're getting treatment for it, I would say it's a foregone conclusion. Because at that point, it had to be affecting your life for you to go through those steps.
Yeah.
What are some of the challenges with our contemporary disability rights laws and systems that you'd want our audience to know about, besides the ones we've already hit on, which is there aren't enough resources, the system is complicated, people often don't know how to advocate it, and the government isn't usually monitoring and enforcing on its own? So are there more things wrong with our legal system in the United States?
Yeah, unfortunately, there are a number of things. I think two that really stand out in my mind, and maybe it's just because I encounter them all the time, is, for people who have in sort of two different areas. One has to do for kids who have disabilities in school. That's one area that presents with some additional complications. And then I would also say another area, and this is not a limited list, these are just examples, but significant examples. Another area are people who have disabilities who are in jail or prison. And so I'll start out with the education one, because there are some similar issues. And that is that in order for, for kids who are eligible for special education services under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, there's a whole host of entitlements or rights that people have. And that's great, or that students have. But if you end up having a dispute with your school district about the services that you should be getting, if you want to go to court and challenge those, you first have to do something called exhausting your administrative remedies. And that means you first have to go to a fair hearing, and you have to go with a hearing officer and go through that process before you can go to court. You can't have a federal court judge or a superior court judge address the problem until you go for these, this administrative process. Well, some people might say, well, that's a good thing because an administrative process seems less complicated than going to file a lawsuit, and it is. However, the problem is that process can really take a long time. It can turn into a very complicated process itself. And so even though it's an administrative process, it's not an easy process. And a lot of times school districts will have attorneys on the, in those hearings, and they turn into like little lawsuits on their own or like it, and so it just takes a long time to go to court. And so that can be really, and there are just some procedural barriers that just make it complicated. There's a similar problem for people who are in jails and prisons, and also kids who are in juvenile detention facilities too. So if you're having problems in that situation where you have any sort of problem with your conditions of care, and even in many places, disability discrimination, before you can actually file a lawsuit and ask a judge to resolve the problem, you have to go through the jail or prison or juvenile detentions facilities grievance procedure. And that grievance procedure can be very complicated. And you have to go through every step. You have to follow all the rules, use their form. And if you have a disability that interferes with your ability to understand that process, it can be very difficult because you can't have somebody else filing those complaints for you. You have to do it yourself. So that can be very onerous and very difficult and make it really hard to get the resolution that you need. And I'm sorry, because I know a lot of this seems so negative, but it's this balance of there's these rights, but then how do you enforce them? How do you have your rights protected? How can you enforce them when they've been violated? And so those are just two examples of difficult barriers, I would say.
Yeah, it reminds me when I was a law student, I remember actually looking at the record about a case in which an incarcerated person who was blind was trying to go to court to challenge abuses in the prison. And the judge refused to hear the case because the inmate had not completed paperwork for which there was no accessible version for blind people. So because they couldn't see the form and couldn't file the form, they couldn't be heard by the court, which seems like a very flagrant violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. But then it was this sort of catch-22 where even if they wanted to sue the prison for violating the ADA, they still couldn't do it because you can't get to court until you go through their process. And if they put up a barrier that a person with disabilities can't get past, then practically that means you can't get to court.
Right, exactly. And while there's some very narrow exceptions to that requirement, those are difficult, very difficult to get past. So.
Unfortunate. So education in prisons, disturbing all around. Let's sort of think about what other ways could things be. We know that the United Nations has adopted the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities as an international disability rights law. Does the US follow the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and how does it compare to our laws in the United States?
So while we have not adopted the United States, when I say we, has not adopted the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So it doesn't oppose it or anything like that, but we have not incorporated that into our law. And that is kind of in keeping with other international laws so we have not done that. Other countries around the world have. So we as a country do not have to comply with the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities because we haven't adopted that as our law. People, I've heard people argue, well, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, we have other, federal protections for people, fair housing laws, education laws, we have other protections for people with disabilities. So we don't need the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, but other advocates would say, well, that's, while it's true we have these, other laws, it would be, beneficial, and it would be more expansive if we could, in fact, have, also adopt the rights of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, called the CRPD for short. But unfortunately, we haven't done that. It is more expansive, and you can see just when you go and you look at the rights and the way that they're written, you can see a good example is in the area of self-determination and autonomy for people with disabilities. And there, really strong language in there that recognizes the rights of people to have that. And there's a lot of good language in various state statutes, or recognizing that, but we still have a lot of guardianships, a lot of conservatorships in the United States, and a lot of restrictions on the autonomy of people with disabilities and their self-determination. And so having having the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, if we had that, I think that would really expand the rights because of the way the language is.
Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. The audience is asking us another question, which is, how common are disability rights violations? And, would we think of them as more or less common than other rights violations? And I'll qualify. Sometimes that would be a hard question to answer because there's not good data, right? We're not tracking it. Yeah. And because it's sometimes not either or. Disability discrimination can be entangled with race discrimination or religious discrimination or sex discrimination or age discrimination. That's a common one. Yeah. So, so it would be hard to even separate out. But do you have more thoughts on that question? Is it common?
Well, I think you're right. It's hard to measure like what common means, but what I can say is that we receive complaints all the time, and we have dozens of intakes every single day that come into our office. And certainly when we go out and we meet with people, for example, at a prison or a state hospital or in a nursing home, we ourselves identify rights violations constantly. And we also hear from our individual clients and the people, our constituents, that there are rights violations going on all the time. And usually what I would say about that is that for the most part, when rights violations occur, it's not because somebody is a bad person and wants to violate the rights of people with disabilities. Usually it's that people don't realize that there's a right to be violated or that they're doing that. Sometimes it's intentional. Sometimes it's, they should have known, but a lot of times people don't know, or they might know, but they are, and they don't really want to do it, but they feel like they have to because it's some financial reason why, and they make a financial choice. And so then the question becomes, well, are they, is the financial reason a good enough excuse to justify the decision to, take an adverse action against a person with a disability? But to, the question is, yeah, there's a lot. And I think it's hard to, Beth, your point about them all being, it's hard to pull apart. Is it just disability rights, or is it combined with other rights? Because there's so much intersection between them. So there can often be a situation where you have people who have had their rights violated in part because of their disability, but also because maybe their race, their ethnicity, their gender, whether or not they're a person who lives in poverty. It could be everything. It could be a couple. So it really is you have to, whenever we get a case comes into our office, we have to take a look at the situation as a whole, because it's really hard to break it down and pull it apart.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. So we're short on time, but I want to see if we can squeeze in just a few more quick items. Well, not that quick, but we'll try to at least touch on them. Can you say a little bit more about the relationship between disability discrimination and race and gender and economic discrimination? And are there differences in the ways in which people are able to access disability rights laws? Like, is everybody able to use them equally? Are race and gender and class and other categories of vulnerability or subordination affecting the way that people can access disability rights?
Yeah, well, definitely there are differences. So while the Americans with Disabilities Act applies to everybody here in the United States, the way in which a person may be able to enforce their rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act or other disability rights statutes and regulations, really that really does vary quite a bit based on different things like race issues and ethnicity, and also poverty, just being able to afford for all of there's a whole host of factors. So for example, because we talked about the difficulties in finding an attorney to represent you. So if you have money, if you're in a situation where you have some money and you can hire an attorney, that's great. Then you can hire a lawyer, and maybe the lawyer will help you. But if you don't have those financial means, that's going to be really hard, really, really hard. Also, we know that laws practices, policies and practices that are discriminatory also have an effect that brings in this question of the intersection of different things. So a really good example let's go back to the education example, because it's a good example. But kids who are in special education, they're among the highest, among the groups who get suspended and expelled from school and arrested at school because of behavioral problems that are related to disability. At the same time, we also know that the data around the United States shows that kids who are brown or Black also get arrested at the highest rates, and also subject to school-based arrests, and also suspended and expelled. When you take the two groups and you put them together, then those groups, the people, the children who are Black or brown and have disabilities, particularly mental health disabilities, those are the kids that get suspended, expelled, and arrested at school the most. And that's what the data shows. And so yet all of, if all of these kids are kids in special education, shouldn't the special education laws apply to them equally? Well, yes, they do, on the paper, but the way in which things are being implemented can be very different. And so what you can find is that if you have a child who is white with a disability who has a behavioral problem, they may more likely end up getting the services that they need, so they don't get expelled, suspended, or arrested at school. Whereas there's a big disparity for kids who are brown or Black with disabilities who don't have the same experience. I don't know if
I'm
that
hearing, oh, sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
I'm hearing that race and economics are interacting with disability-based vulnerabilities in a number of ways. One, they're creating specific forms of discrimination, which are heightened or intensified or not occurring with the same frequency for people who are not both racially or economically vulnerable and dealing with disability. And second, that there are also economic barriers which are likely to be racially disparate or racially distributed unevenly to getting the rights and resources that you might need to either just make, for instance, education or work more accessible, or to combat disability discrimination. So more discrimination, less access to rights and resources. Is that a reasonable, very broad summary?
Exactly right.
Okay. We could dive a lot deeper into this subject, but I at least wanted to acknowledge it. Let me close with just a couple last questions. If you were writing new policy in the United States, wish list, dream big, what would you want to do? What new law would you want to see go into effect soon?
Oh, wow. There's so many choices.
A lot to fix.
Yeah. I think that I would like to see sort of a couple, well, I don't know if there's one that I could pick, but I think having access to services in the most integrated setting is something that's really, really important. And so I would really like to see an expansion of community-based housing and services for people with disabilities, so that people don't have to be in segregated situations, and that they have
an institution or a home.
Right, in an institution, or in a segregated school. It could be in the segregation unfortunately can happen in the community as well as in an institution. So yeah, I would want to see people integrated into the community and have the services that they need, so that and expanding eligibility for people, because a lot of people for a variety of reasons, find themselves ineligible for services or lose eligibility when they didn't mean to. So making it easier to become eligible and stay eligible for services, so that people aren't in crisis. So I guess that's probably the thing I would do first.
Okay, thank you. Last question. We love to ask our interviewees or guests for reading recommendations, because a lot of our listeners or attendees want to know more about the subject. Do you have a favorite book or books, or just something that you think is really interesting to recommend to the audience here today that you wouldn't have to have a law degree in order to read?
Oh yeah. So there's a wonderful book called Boys in the Bunkhouse, and I don't have the author's name at the moment, but if you look up Boys in the Bunkhouse, you'll find it. And it's about some men with intellectual disabilities who were taken from a Texas institution back in the 70s and sent to Iowa to a turkey farm, where they were made to basically work at doing sort of involuntary servitude, and they're forced to live in this old horrible bunkhouse, where they basically gutted turkeys for years and years and years, and they weren't compensated for their work, and they were living in really abusive conditions. And they were finally discovered and removed from the bunkhouse many years later, around 2008 or 9. So it took many decades to find them. Now some of them, I actually have worked with some of them in a case I did separate from this, but now some are living in the community with families for the first time in their lives, even though they spent decades, living in this situation. And I think what's so amazing, I mean, the story is obviously heartbreaking, but what's amazing about these guys is just their, perseverance and, really their resilience, to have, having to have really been, discriminated against and abused and neglected for all those years, but yet, many of them were able to come out and move to the community and be, full participants in the community in spite of all of that. And I think, that's the wonderful part of the story. And so I think it's really one of my favorites.
Yeah, very painful as well, but definitely important to learn more about what it means to survive in that situation. And when you said involuntary servitude, just to clarify for our audience, that means slave labor.
Pretty much. I mean, they only got like maybe a tiny little bit of money, but they were basically working really long hours, doing really hard work, because gutting, turkeys is not an easy job. And they really weren't being paid, they weren't getting their wages, just a little bit of spending money here and there. And then they lived in these horrible, horrible conditions in some old broken down bunkhouse in Iowa. So.
Well, thank you, Deborah, so much for sharing this with us today. And the full title of the book, one of our audience members is asking, is The Boys in the Bunkhouse by Dan Barry.
There we go.
Yeah. Okay, great.
From the New York Times, I think.
So I so appreciate you coming and sharing a little knowledge with our audience. I want to invite everyone to join us next week. We are really excited to feature a visit from Dr. Janine Abrams-McLean, who will be speaking to us about the US Census. Dr. Abrams-McLean is representing Fair Count in Georgia, of which she is the vice president, and it deals with the census and voting rights. And along with her sister, Stacey Abrams, she's been among the lead people in the state of Georgia and in the nation, I think, really unmasking some of the racial disparities in voting that are attached to the US Census. So again, I hope folks will join us on May 30th to hear from Dr. Abrams-McLean. And this week, if you are free for our monthly film screening, this Wednesday, the 26th at 4 o'clock Pacific, 7 o'clock Eastern time, we'll be screening and discussing the Frontline documentary, United States of Conspiracy. So for those who are interested, join us this Wednesday. Next Sunday, we'll be back with the Civics Project to hear from Dr. Abrams-McLean. Thank you so much, everybody. Zoom audience, hang out for a moment if you have last questions for Deborah Dorfman and for our podcast listeners. We so appreciate you tuning in. Thank you.